I wasn't supposed to still be there that late. My flight had been delayed twice already, and by the time the second delay was announced, most of the terminal had started to empty out. People either rebooked, left, or found somewhere else to wait. I stayed because my flight was still listed as on schedule after the delay, and I didn't want to risk missing another update. The gate was near the end of the terminal, past most of the open shops and seating areas. By the time it got close to midnight, everything around me had gone quiet. The stores were closed, the lights were dimmed slightly, and the few people who had been sitting nearby earlier were gone. I remember noticing it slowly, not all at once. One moment there were a few scattered travelers, and the next it felt like the entire space had cleared out without me realizing when it happened. I was sitting near the charging station phone plugged in, just watching the gate display. It still showed my flight number, still marked as delayed, but there was no staff at the desk anymore. That wasn't unusual at first. I figured they were rotating shifts or handling something at another gate, but after a while it started to feel strange that no one came back. I checked the time, 1:18 a.m. The terminal lights overhead were still on, but the brightness had dropped slightly, like the airport had shifted into a quieter mode, the kind of lighting that makes everything feel a little more distant. I looked around again. No one in the rows of seats across from me, no movement near the hallway leading to the restrooms. Even the cleaning carts I had seen earlier were gone. It wasn't completely silent, but the sounds were far away now. Announcements echoed faintly from another part of the airport, too distant to make out clearly. I stood up and walked a few steps toward the gate desk. Still empty. The monitor above it flickered slightly as it refreshed, showing the same delay message again. I leaned closer just to read it more clearly, even though I already knew what it said. Nothing had changed. I stepped back and looked down the terminal in both directions. The left side led back toward the main concourse. The right side stretched further, into a section that looked completely unused at that hour. Darker. Quieter. I didn't go that way. I went back to my seat and sat down again, trying to ignore the feeling that the space had changed, because technically nothing had. The lights were still on, the gate was still active, my flight was still listed, but the absence of people made everything feel different. I picked up my phone and checked for updates again. Nothing new. No notifications, no emails, just the same status I had seen for the last hour. I stayed there, sitting still, trying to convince myself that it was normal for airports to feel like this late at night. And it probably was, at least to some extent, but something about that gate felt more empty than it should have. After a few minutes, I noticed something small. The display above the desk changed, not the flight information, but the brightness. It dimmed slightly, then returned to normal, like it had refreshed again. I looked up at it, watching to see if it would happen again. It didn't. I waited a few seconds, then looked away. That's when I heard something behind me. Not loud, just a faint shift, like a chair being moved slightly across the floor. I turned immediately. The rows of seats behind me were empty, exactly the way they had been a few seconds earlier. No movement, no one there. I stared at them for a moment, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. It hadn't echoed like the announcements did. It had sounded close. Inside that space, I stood up again slower this time and walked a few steps toward the seats. Nothing. No signs that anything had moved. Everything was in place, perfectly still. I told myself it had to be something simple. Maybe the building settling. Maybe a sound from another gate that just carried in a strange way. That explanation worked for a few seconds. Then I heard it again, this time from the direction of the gate desk. I turned back toward it. Still empty, but something felt different. Not visually, just in the way the space held stillness. I walked back toward the desk, stopping a few feet away. The monitor flickered again, briefly, then returned to normal. I didn't touch anything. I didn't call out. I just stood there listening. Nothing else happened. After a minute, I stepped back and returned to my seat. I sat down facing the gate, trying to keep everything in view at once. The desk, the monitor, the rows of seats behind me, the hallway. I didn't want to turn away again. A few minutes passed. Then, without warning, the display updated. The delay message disappeared, replaced by a boarding time. Not a new time, just the word boarding next to my flight number. I leaned forward, staring at it. That didn't make sense. There was no announcement, no staff, no other passengers, just the screen changing. I looked around again. Still no one. The entire gate area remained empty, and that was the moment something shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore, because up until then, everything could have been explained. The silence. The sounds, the empty space, but the system updating, changing status without anyone there to trigger it. That didn't feel like something random. That felt like something continuing, without needing anyone present. I didn't move right away after the screen changed. I just sat there staring at the word boarding, trying to understand how it could update without anyone there. No announcement, no staff returning to the desk, no passengers gathering, just the system changing on its own. I told myself there had to be a delay in communication, something happening behind the scenes that I wasn't seeing. Maybe the boarding process had started at another location. Maybe they were preparing something and hadn't come back to the gate yet. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something didn't feel right. Because if boarding had actually started, there should have been movement. There should have been people. I stood up slowly and walked toward the desk again, closer this time. The monitor remained steady, showing the same updated status, boarding. The area around it stayed completely empty. I looked down the terminal once more, hoping to see someone coming toward the gate, but the space remained still. No footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of the building itself. I stepped closer to the desk, close enough that I could see the keyboard and scanner sitting there unused. Everything looked exactly as it had before, no signs that anyone had returned. I didn't touch anything. I didn't call out. I just stood there listening, waiting for something to happen that would make sense of it. Nothing did. After a few seconds, I stepped back again and returned to my seat, but this time I didn't sit all the way down. I stayed on the edge, ready to stand up again if I needed to. I kept my eyes on the monitor, watching for another change. A minute passed, then another. The word boarding stayed there unchanged. Then, without warning, I heard something behind me again. Not the same as before. This time it was clearer. A single step. I turned immediately. The seats behind me were still empty, but something about the space felt different, like the sound had come from closer than before. I stood up fully now, turning slowly in place, trying to see if there was anything I had missed. There wasn't. Every row of seats was exactly the same, perfectly still. I told myself it had to be sound traveling again, something from another part of the terminal, but the way it echoed or didn't echo made that harder to believe. It had sounded too contained, like it belonged to this space. I turned back toward the gate, trying to refocus on something that felt more stable. The monitor flickered again, this time longer. The image distorted slightly before returning to normal. I stared at it, waiting for it to change again. It didn't. But a few seconds later, I heard something else. Not behind me, not from the side, from the gate itself. A soft, mechanical sound, like a scanner activating. I looked down at the desk. The scanner was still there, untouched. No light, no movement, but the sound had been clear. I stepped closer, again, slower, this time more aware of each movement I made. As I moved, I paid attention to the space around me, listening for any response. Nothing happened immediately. The silence held. I reached the desk and stopped. For a moment, everything felt still again. Then, I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to adjust my stance. From somewhere just beyond the gate entrance, I heard a step. Not loud, not rushed, just one. I froze. The sound didn't repeat, but it didn't feel like it had come from far away either. It felt like it was just past the threshold of the gate. Somewhere I couldn't see without going further. I didn't go further. I stayed where I was, staring at the opening, trying to decide if I should move closer or step back. Another few seconds passed. Then I shifted again, just slightly. Another step. Same direction. Same distance. My chest tightened, but I didn't turn away, because now the pattern was clear. Movement triggered movement. I stepped back once. The space went silent again. I waited. Nothing followed. I stepped forward again, just a small movement. Another step came from beyond the gate. Not closer, not further, just matching. That was the moment something settled in my mind. It wasn't just that the space was empty, it was that it wasn't inactive. It was responding. I didn't test it again. I didn't want to know how far that pattern extended. I stepped back fully this time, turning away from the gate and walking toward the main concourse without looking back. I didn't rush. I didn't run. But I didn't stop either. As I moved away, I listened carefully, waiting to see if anything would follow, if any sound would continue behind me. Nothing did. The further I got from that gate, the more the normal sounds of the airport returned. Distant announcements, rolling luggage, faint voices. By the time I reached the brighter part of the terminal, everything felt grounded again, real. I didn't go back to that gate. I didn't wait for another update. I found a different seating area closer to the main concourse, and stayed there until my flight information updated again, this time with a new gate number entirely. I boarded from that gate without any issues. There were people, staff, announcements, everything normal. I didn't mention what had happened to anyone. I didn't ask about the previous gate, and I didn't check it again. But something about that night stayed with me. Not because I saw something I couldn't explain, but because of how the space behaved when it was empty. Because sometimes it's not about someone being there. Sometimes it's about a place continuing to respond, even when it looks like no one is. I wasn't trying to go anywhere. I wasn't supposed to be. That part came later. At the time, I was just looking for somewhere quieter to sit. My flight had been delayed for almost 3 hours, and the main terminal was still crowded enough that it didn't feel comfortable to stay in one place for too long. People were moving constantly. Announcements kept interrupting the silence, and every seat near an outlet was taken. I just wanted a space where things slowed down a little. That's how I ended up near that section of the airport. It wasn't completely blocked off, just less active. The lighting was dimmer, and there were fewer signs pointing in that direction. Most people stayed closer to the main gates. This area felt like something between open and closed. Not officially restricted, but not meant for regular traffic either. I noticed the sign first, temporarily closed. It was placed near a wide hallway that led deeper into the terminal, but the barrier wasn't fully set up. One side was open, just enough to walk through without moving anything. I stood there for a moment looking at it, trying to decide if it actually meant anything. There were no staff nearby, no tape, no clear indication that I couldn't go in, just the sign. I looked around. No one else seemed to be paying attention to it. People passed by without even glancing in that direction. After a few seconds, I stepped through. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The noise from the main terminal dropped off sharply, replaced by a quieter, more contained sound. My footsteps echoed slightly more in that space. The lights overhead were still on, but dimmer like they hadn't been adjusted for regular use. The hallway stretched further than I expected, leading into a wider area with seating that looked unused. Chairs were arranged neatly, untouched, like no one had been there for a while. I walked slowly, not rushing, just taking in the space. It felt different from the rest of the airport. Not abandoned exactly, just paused, like it was waiting to be used again. I found a seat near the center and sat down, placing my bag next to me. For the first time that night, everything felt still. No announcements, no conversations, just the low hum of the building system somewhere in the background. I checked my phone. No updates, same delay, same gate. I leaned back slightly and closed my eyes for a moment, just listening to the quiet. That's when I heard it. A sound from somewhere further down the section. Not loud, just a slight shift, like something being moved across the floor. I opened my eyes immediately and looked in that direction. Nothing. The area ahead of me remained empty. Rows of seats, a few closed kiosks, and a hallway that turned out of view. I sat up a little straighter, focusing more carefully now. The sound didn't repeat right away. I told myself it was probably something settling. Air systems, maybe. These places are large. Sound moves in strange ways. That explanation held for a few seconds. Then, I heard it again. This time clearer. A dragging sound, followed by a soft step. My chest tightened slightly, but I stayed where I was. I didn't get up right away. I just listened. The sound didn't continue into a full pattern. It stopped after that. Silence returned, just like before, but now it felt different, more concentrated. I stood up slowly, picking up my bag, and took a few steps forward. I didn't go all the way toward where the sound came from. I just moved closer enough to change my position in the space. As I stepped forward, the silence held. No immediate response. I stopped walking and waited. A few seconds passed. Then I heard it again. A step. From further down the section, not rushing, not approaching, just present. I didn't move again. I stayed still, trying to understand the distance. It didn't sound far, but it didn't sound close either, like it was staying just beyond where I could clearly locate it. I took another step. Slowly. The sound came again. Same delay, same measured movement. My chest tightened more this time, because now it wasn't just a random noise. It was a pattern, movement. Then response. I stopped. The sound stopped. I stood there in the middle of that quiet section, staring into the empty space ahead, trying to decide if I should go further or turn back. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. But the timing didn't match anything normal. I took one more step forward, and this time the sound didn't come from ahead of me, it came from behind. I turned immediately. The path I had just walked was empty, completely still, no movement, no one there, but the sound had been clear, close. I didn't go further into that section after that. I stepped back, slowly, returning to where I had been sitting before. The moment I stopped moving, the space went completely silent again. No dragging, no footsteps, just the same low hum in the background. I stood there for a moment trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just sound reflecting off the walls in a strange way. But the more I thought about it, the harder that explanation became. Because the sound hadn't just existed, it had followed position, and that was the part I couldn't ignore. I didn't leave right away. That was the part I questioned later. I had already noticed the pattern, already felt that something in that space wasn't behaving normally, but instead of walking straight back to the main terminal, I stayed. Not because I felt safe, but because I wanted to understand it before I left. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Sound traveling, air systems, something mechanical. Airports are complex spaces. It made sense that not everything would behave predictably. But even as I tried to hold on to that, I knew what I had heard didn't match anything I had experienced before. I stood still for a while, then slowly shifted my weight again, just enough to test the space, without fully committing to moving deeper into it. A few seconds passed. Then, the sound came again. A single step, this time from my left. Not directly ahead, not behind, just repositioned. I turned my head slightly in that direction. The rows of seats were empty, the kiosks were closed, nothing moved. I didn't walk toward it, I didn't want to get closer. Instead, I took a small step backward. The moment I did, the sound stopped, completely. That was the first time I noticed how precise the timing was. It wasn't just that movement triggered sound, it was that the direction of movement seemed to change where the sound came from. I stayed still again, trying to slow everything down. Then, I stepped forward just slightly. The sound returned. Same delay, but this time it came from further ahead, closer to where the hallway turned out of view. My chest tightened, but I didn't go toward it. I didn't want to follow it into a place I couldn't see clearly. I stopped moving again. Silence. That was the pattern. Not random, not continuous, controlled, responsive. I picked up my bag again and held it closer, this time more out of instinct than anything else. Then I tried something different. Instead of stepping forward or backward, I shifted sideways, just one step to the right. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sound came again, but not from the same direction as before. It adjusted, like it was maintaining a certain distance, not tied to a fixed location, but to where I was within the space. That realization settled in slowly, but once it did, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just something happening in that section. It was something responding to position. I didn't test it again. I didn't want to see how far that pattern extended. Instead, I turned around and started walking back toward the main terminal. Not quickly, not running, just steady, controlled movement. As I took the first few steps away, I listened carefully, waiting to see if the sound would follow. It didn't, at least not immediately. The space stayed silent. That almost made me feel like I had imagined it, like leaving had broken whatever pattern I thought I noticed. But then after a few more steps, I heard it again. Not behind me, not directly, just somewhere within that section. A step, then nothing. I didn't turn around, I kept walking. The closer I got to the main terminal, the more the normal airport sounds returned. Distant voices, announcements, the rolling of luggage. It layered over everything else, making it harder to focus on what was happening behind me. By the time I reached the edge of that section, the transition was immediate. Brighter lights, more open space. People again. Not many, but enough to break that isolated feeling. I stepped fully out of the closed area and stopped. Just for a second. Then I turned around. The section behind me looked exactly the way it had before. Quiet. Still. No movement. No sign that anything had been there at all. I stood there for a moment, watching it, trying to decide if I should go back in. Not to explore, but just to confirm what I had experienced. I didn't. Something about crossing that boundary again didn't feel right, so I turned away and walked back toward my gate instead. The rest of the night felt normal by comparison. Not completely comfortable, but grounded. Predictable. I stayed in the main terminal, closer to other people, even if it meant dealing with noise and movement again. My flight eventually updated, and I boarded without any issues. There were staff, announcements, Everything functioning the way it should have. But even after I left the airport, that section stayed in my mind. Not because I saw something I couldn't explain, but because of how the space behaved when it was quiet. Because it wasn't just empty. It felt active in a way that didn't need anyone there. I don't go into closed sections anymore, even if they look accessible, even if there's no one around to stop me. Because I learned something that night that I can't ignore. Sometimes it's not about something following you. Sometimes it's about a place that adjusts to where you are, even when it looks like no one is there at all. I didn't mean to go that far down the terminal. My gate had been moved twice already, and by the time the second change was announced, I was just following the signs without really paying attention to where they were leading. It was late enough that most of the airport had started to quiet down. Not completely empty, but thinner. Less movement, less noise. The kind of atmosphere where every step feels more noticeable. The hallway I ended up in wasn't closed off, but it didn't feel like part of the main flow of traffic either. It was long-lined with glass panels on one side and a solid wall on the other. The lighting was dimmer than the rest of the terminal, and the reflections in the glass stretched further than I expected, repeating the space in a way that made it feel longer than it actually was. I slowed down as I walked through it, not because I was tired, but because something about the space felt different. The reflections were clear, almost too clear. Every movement I made was mirrored perfectly at first. My steps, my posture, the way I adjusted my bag on my shoulder, it all matched. I didn't think anything of it right away. That's how reflections work. But after a few seconds, I noticed something small. When I stopped walking, my reflection didn't stop immediately. It wasn't a big delay, just a fraction of a second, small enough that I almost ignored it. I told myself it was the angle or the way the glass was layered. Airports use multiple panes sometimes. That could create a slight visual lag. I kept walking. The reflection continued to match me, but now I was paying more attention. Every step, every pause. I stopped again. This time I watched more carefully. My body came to a stop. The reflection followed, just slightly after. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel off. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at it, trying to decide if I was imagining it. Then, I moved my arm, slowly. The reflection moved too, but again, not perfectly in sync. That's when I felt that shift. The same kind of realization you get when something stops being explainable in a simple way. I didn't move for a moment. Then, I took another step forward. The reflection followed, slight delay, same pattern. I told myself it had to be the glass, the lighting, something physical, something normal. But the more I watched it, the harder that explanation became, because the delay wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was barely noticeable, other times it felt longer, like it adjusted depending on how I moved. I slowed down even more, almost to a stop, just walking one step at a time, watching the reflection closely. Step, pause. The reflection caught up, then held. I turned my head slightly to the side. The reflection did the same, but not immediately. That was the moment I stopped walking completely. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, facing the glass, trying to understand what I was seeing. Because it wasn't just a delay anymore. It felt like the reflection was reacting. Not perfectly mirroring, but following. I stepped back. The reflection stepped back. But again, not at the same time. I waited. The reflection held its position for a second longer than I did, then adjusted. My chest tightened slightly, but I didn't turn away. I wanted to see if the pattern would stay consistent. I raised my hand again, slower this time. The reflection followed, delayed, controlled. Not random. I didn't like that. Not because it was obviously wrong, but because it wasn't consistent enough to explain easily. If it had been a fixed delay, I could have accepted it as a visual effect. But it wasn't. It changed. I stepped to the side. The reflection followed. Slight delay. I stopped. It stopped just after. I took another step forward. The reflection matched, but this time the delay felt longer. I stared at it, trying to measure the difference, trying to convince myself it was just my perception. But the more I focused on it, the more precise it felt. Like the timing wasn't accidental. I looked down the hallway. It stretched further than I expected, the reflections repeating into the distance. For a second, I thought I saw movement further down the glass. Not my own reflection, something else. I blinked and looked again. Nothing. Just the same repeating image of the hallway. I told myself it was the way the reflections overlapped. That's what glass does in spaces like this. It creates depth where there isn't any. I turned back to my own reflection. It was still there, still slightly behind my movement. I didn't move this time. I just stood there watching it, and after a few seconds, I realized something that made the space feel different in a way I couldn't ignore. The reflection wasn't just delayed, it was holding position until I moved again. I didn't move right away after realizing that. I just stood there facing the glass, trying to understand what it meant. Because up until that point, I had been focusing on the delay, on the idea that the reflection was simply lagging behind my movement. But this felt different. It wasn't just behind, it was waiting. I tested it slowly. I shifted my weight slightly to one side. The reflection stayed where it was for a moment longer than it should have, then adjusted. Not smoothly, not instantly, just enough to match me after I had already moved. I stopped again. The reflection stopped, but not at the same time. That slight gap remained. I told myself it had to be something with the glass. Multiple layers, lighting conditions, something technical that I didn't fully understand. But even as I thought that, something didn't sit right. Because if it were just a visual delay, it would be consistent, predictable. This wasn't. It changed depending on how I moved. I took a step forward. The reflection followed slightly behind. I stopped. It stopped just after. Then I did something different. Instead of stopping completely, I slowed my movement almost to nothing, like I was trying to move without actually changing position. The reflection hesitated. That was the only way I could describe it. It didn't match me right away. It stayed where it was for a fraction longer, then shifted forward, catching up. My chest tightened, but I didn't look away. I needed to see if the pattern would hold. I stepped back this time, slowly. The reflection followed, but again, not immediately. And this time the delay felt longer. Not dramatically, but enough to notice without questioning it. I stopped again. The reflection held its position. Not where I was now, but where I had been a moment before. That was when I felt something change in the way I understood what I was seeing. It wasn't just reacting to my movement, it was holding on to previous positions. I didn't test it further right away. I just stood there, staring, trying to process that idea. Then after a few seconds, I shifted again, just slightly. The reflection moved, but instead of matching my current position, it seemed to move from where it had been before, like it was catching up in steps, not in real time. I took a slow breath, trying to stay calm, trying to keep everything controlled. Then I looked further down the hallway again. The reflection stretched out, repeating the space over and over, and for a moment I thought I saw something again. Not clearly, just a slight misalignment in the distance. Like one of the reflections wasn't matching the others perfectly. I blinked, looked again. Everything appeared normal, but the feeling stayed. I turned back to the glass in front of me. My reflection was still there, still slightly behind, still not quite right. I decided to stop testing it, not because I was scared, but because I didn't want to confirm anything further. I stepped away from the glass and turned toward the direction I had come from. As I did, I caught a glimpse of the reflection shifting behind me, delayed. I didn't look back directly. I just started walking. Not fast, not running, just steady, controlled. Each step I took felt louder, now more noticeable in the quiet hallway. I focused on the end of the corridor and getting back to the main terminal, where there were people, noise, something that felt normal. As I walked, I became aware of something else. The reflection behind me wasn't matching my pace exactly. I could see it in the edge of the glass as I moved. It was following, but not in sync. I didn't turn to look directly at it. I didn't want to give it that attention again. I just kept walking. The closer I got to the main terminal, the brighter the lighting became. The reflections became less pronounced, less clear. The space started to feel normal again, grounded. When I finally stepped out of that hallway, the transition was immediate. Noise returned. People, movement, everything layered back into place. I stopped for a second, just to let that shift settle. Then slowly, I turned my head slightly, just enough to look back toward the hallway without fully facing it. The glass panels were still there, still reflecting the space, but from that distance everything looked normal. No delay, no misalignment, just reflections behaving the way they should. I didn't go back in, I didn't try to check it again. I just turned away and walked toward my new gate. The rest of the night felt normal by comparison. Not comfortable, but understandable, predictable. I boarded my flight without any issues. Everything worked the way it was supposed to, but something about that hallway stayed with me. Not because I saw something impossible, but because of how it behaved when I paid attention to it. Because sometimes, it's not about seeing something that shouldn't be there. Sometimes, it's about noticing that something you expect to follow you doesn't do it the way it should. And once you see that difference, it's hard to ignore it again.